It's just to give a very quick overview of food safety management and traceability, and from our own experience here in Ireland. So I've quite a large slide deck, but I'm going to go through a lot of it very quickly, but I will take part in the discussions afterwards in case people have any questions or anything they'd like to go through. Sorry, I'm just going to get this working. Okay, so just to kick off, I suppose everyone's aware really food safety has become a very global issue. I think years ago, a lot of incidents and problems remained quite localized, and we accept now that you know, with food miles and air miles, the problem travels very quickly, I suppose, in essence. As Alexandra has said there earlier, like, we're lucky in Europe that there is such a robust and a strong food safety management system, and such a good network in place for communicating any issues or incidents. And luckily member states, I think, take the responsibility of it very seriously. I'm hoping just in this presentation to give some best practices maybe from our experience in Ireland and some of the challenges as well. It's not always easy, and I think anyone who's working on the ground or in the thick of it there will agree. You do come up against problems as well, so it's just to shed some light on those. So the experience in Ireland really, businesses would have quite good food safety management systems in general, I think it's fair to say. They would have structured and documented policies, procedures, and good document control as well. There's generally 7 key pillars to a food safety management system in practice in Ireland. So things like supplier approval, analysis, whether it's microbiological or chemical, sensory testing and organoleptic assessments, customer complaints, traceability, which we'll have a look at a bit more in depth now, product safety, and then internal audits to verify and validate systems. So foremost, I think it's fair to say traceability is a headache. I also think from the competent authority point of view, it's a bigger headache where it's either not fully in place or doesn't work properly. We've had experiences over the years where we've seen through the dioxin crisis or the horse meat scandal, what challenges it presents when businesses don't have good operational traceability systems in place. So I suppose it's getting that across to businesses on the ground and making sure that what they do have in place actually works and that it is effective. Obviously, it's from farm to fork. It affects the producer right down to the customer. And, you know, you'll often hear of the farm to fork approach, stable to table, one step forward, one step back. It's how that's actually working in practice. So I just have a quick slide here. It's a very, very basic, just to show, I suppose, and we'll talk a little more about batches and lots further down the presentation, because I do think it's key to a functional traceability system. But I suppose a good depiction here is just the cow with the lot number, and we'll have a look at bovine tagging further down as well, how the lot or the batch traceability follows through the process onto the end customer and how they're all linked to keep the traceability throughout the full distribution chain. An example there again, a cow, typically Irish, born in Ireland, reared in Spain, slaughtered in France, eaten in Germany. Again, it just highlights, I suppose, as does the next slide, we have the world on our plate essentially when we're eating something. A typical garlic chicken Kiev here, for example, you could have the herb butter from one country, the chicken from another, the batter, the breadcrumb. We can go on, I suppose, and as you add layers or add dimensions to food products, you literally do have the world on your plate. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the regulatory framework. I think everyone, it's fair to say, is quite familiar with it. And it's obviously laid down in Regulation 178 under Article 18. I suppose the picture here is just a message for everyone that, you know, traceability is only as strong as the weakest link, really, and it only takes one weak link in a chain whether it's, you know, a processor, a producer, a retailer. It only takes one weak link to make for a very difficult successful traceability, particularly where it comes to a product withdrawal or recall. And I know we've had experiences ourselves as the competent authority where there's either a breakdown in the traceability or something, and then it's all hell breaks loose in terms of what is actually to be withdrawn or recalled, the precautionary principle. Everything features at that point in terms of identifying what's safe and potentially unsafe as well. So just a note there, just very quickly on Article 18 and the guidance, the information that must be kept. So the name and address of the supplier and the product supplied, the name and address of the customers. So that's literally your one step forward, one step back, and the date of transaction or delivery. And just to say, a lot of smaller businesses in particular, and particularly in smaller countries, I think as well, they would rely very much on transaction documents. So whether it's sales records or dispatch notes or invoicing, they rely quite heavily on that for traceability, which can cause delays. So in practice, it works until there's an issue, and then it slows down the whole process. Additional information that it's highly recommended to keep, and I suppose again from experience, the volumes or quantities. Very important when it comes to mass balance. The batch number, if one has been allocated, if it's not being based on sales documents, and a more detailed description of the product or if the subcategories of products in particular. I'm not going to go through this, but just, I suppose this is very useful, I think, for anybody. The FSAI has devised a guidance note. It's guidance note 10, and you can see the picture there on screen. But for anyone who's interested, there's quite a lot of detail in that. It links in the EU regulation. It gives kind of best practice and quite a lot of guidance. We would find the industry, this is a bit of a Bible to them, to be honest. They rely quite heavily on this. And it probably, it puts it into more simplified English, I suppose, to improve how they can implement it into their business. So for anyone who's interested, it's probably worth having a look at that document, just even as a reference guide, but we find it's helped industry an awful lot in Ireland. The key steps in developing a traceability process. The scope is obviously very important of the traceability. Batch size, I'm going to come back to, and I'll probably keep going on about it. I come from 20 years industry experience in the background myself, and I think it's probably the key thing when we're talking about traceability and what works and what doesn't work. Identifying then what information is needed, establishing a system for record keeping and retrieval, document retention for 5 years, and again, we'll look at best practice around that. Establishing procedures for testing or verifying this system then, and checking that it actually works. Documenting the system itself, and then testing the system, whether it's by means of internal audit or mass balance. Two objectives, I suppose, to a traceability system. One is to identify a unique batch or a lot. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. The second is to create and maintain accurate records. Again, key, and we'll have a look. I know Alexandra talked earlier about blockchain technology and kind of digitization of traceability. It feeds a little bit into blockchain in terms of being more of a digitized system and record retention as well. So we'll touch on that a little bit. What is a batch? A batch could be an ingredient batch, a product batch. It's got a unique identifying code. So if there's an issue, it can be very quickly established what products or what lots of finished products are affected should there be an issue that requires, if there's a risk presented or identified, that, you know, we can have efficient and quick removal of product from the market or recall from customers if need be. Optimal batch size. I've referred to this a couple of times, and why I think this is key. Where you get a result, I suppose, for an official sample, and where you have an official control sample. So, for example, in Ireland, we would have competent authorities contracted, like our Department of Agriculture, the HSE, which are the Health Service Executive. They would routinely take samples from businesses. And if a result comes back that's either in breach of legislation or presents a risk to the consumer, this is where your optimal batch size comes into play, because it will limit, I suppose, in some ways, what stock is affected and what action is taken with various lots of stock. Now, it's not to say, we've had businesses argue that they might have the same batch number on a number of different items, and they only want to, say, withdraw or recall, a certain amount of this stock. I think unless businesses have evidence to the contrary, that the rest of the stock is safe, we would always take quite a hard line in Ireland, that unless the evidence is there that they can prove it's safe, an official sample result will stand and action will be taken based on that. I suppose as well, the bigger the batch, the bigger the financial risk. So there is an element of commercial decision there as well in terms of what constitutes an actual batch and the batch size. Benefits of traceability, again, I could probably skim over this: continuous improvement, better compliance, better customer retention. Essentially, it's about ensuring safety and that there's no public health risk at the end of the day. I have a quick graph in there just with conceptual impact of a recall. So here you can see the difference where there's been poor traceability records or good traceability. And certainly it feeds back into the last point that you can limit, I suppose, the amount of stock based on batch, based on traceability records. And I think most people have experience with this as well, good and bad. Some examples of batch traceability, I suppose, just taken from routine things in Ireland. We have egg traceability, very big egg producing country. Obviously loose produce there, there's the tomato, very difficult. And one of the challenges I suppose we have would be if there was a risk to loose products that are sold without packaging. Generally, it's a blanket withdrawal or a blanket recall, because it's very hard to identify stock if there's no traceability code on it. So again, we'd always go above and beyond in terms of removing stock from the market. And then just on fish as well, which I'm sure people are familiar with, things like the catch area, the production methods, the plant code, similar to the plant code that we'd have on products of animal origin. Quick note on packaging traceability, often forgotten about and overlooked. And we did find in the early days, I suppose, smaller businesses in Ireland as well would think of product traceability, but not packaging traceability. So where it's not a feature of Regulation 178, it is part of Article 17 of Regulation 1935, and it's given effect in Ireland by a statutory instrument. So there is, it is transposed into national legislation. Quick note on managing a crisis then, and I have another slide afterwards just to show a work example of this. So it's really looking at the public exposure and time after the event. It goes back really to traceability records and, the paradigm of risk assessment, risk management, risk communication. If we look at the Belgian dioxin crisis as a very quick example, you can see there the time span on the bottom from January to September 1999. And there was 4 things here, I think, they could be takeaway points or learnings from this. The failure or the time lapse really to go public initially with it. And often it's difficult as a risk manager to time things right all of the time. At times it is a judgment call as well, and you're trying to balance the information with the risk level. Failure to trace and public fighting with the EC, I suppose there was a lot of disagreement there at the time, which didn't help. Failure to investigate the issue properly and a lack of trust. And I have some key points there about failures by both the industry and I suppose take-home points from the authorities there in terms of risk assessment, risk communication was key, and the time it took, and then the investigation itself. I'm near the end here. I just want to go through really finally, I suppose, some best practice and a quick couple of slides on good examples from Europe and from Ireland itself. In terms of best practice, if I had to give any advice from, I suppose, all my years in industry and then my years in competent authority as well, Accurate record keeping is key, and there's no doubt about it. And it only takes one lack of a record or missing record or can't read the handwriting to cause a storm. Batch optimization, which we've covered on lot size, is key. Mass balance exercise is highly recommended, and a lot of the better equipped organizations or businesses would do kilos in versus kilos out and mass balance as part of internal audits and processes. Traceability audits, so horizontal audits, vertical audits. Horizontal is basically checking several batches at the same point in a process to ensure the identification is the same, the documentation is the same. And vertical kind of looks at supplier, FBO, right down to the customer. Well-defined roles and responsibilities then, training and retraining, traceability codes and the code format on packs, and often in Ireland the legibility. You'll sometimes find that frozen products, the batch code might scratch off, or it may become faded over time. That they're all little things, but they make it more difficult to identify unique batches of product. One thing often forgotten about here is rework and repacked goods. The repacked goods still have to carry a traceability record, and reworked goods that are put back into the system and end up in finished product, again, often overlooked in practice. Yeah, and just to say, I suppose the traceability system should be reviewed at least annually. Good practice would be to do it more sporadically throughout the year, and then an annual review as well. Quick thing on digitization, obviously it's something that's coming and everyone's looking for improvements and better ways of doing things. We obviously have the Traces system in Europe, which has worked really well to date in terms of kind of enhancing food safety, transparency of information, and it really works well between member states in terms of notifying information, sharing information, everything like that. It's worked well to date. I've one example here that, just from my own experience, is one of the best examples I've seen of a traceability system. It's a vertically integrated system. It's called, and it's not suitable for all businesses, but it gives the business an awful lot of control. So if you take the likes of a chicken nugget factory, where they supply the feed to the farms, they have their own slaughterhouse, they have their own production facility for flash frying and coating the chicken, and then they have their own direct customers or end users, but they have control across the whole system. It gives the highest level of control, and it is a unique selling point for them because they can manage everything, and there's a lot of contingency planning involved. So if there was, for example, the likes of an outbreak of avian flu or something, they'll have other areas where they've been, supplying feed as well, that it allows for that contingency planning, so it doesn't affect the food chain or stocks. Just going on down through the points there, food fraud and biosecurity, I think they're hot topics for everybody in every country. They're relevant to us all. And I don't think anyone is safe in terms of authenticity, substitution, fraud, and biosecurity as it stands at the moment as well. So it's relevant to everyone. I don't want to spend too long. I know Alexandra has referred a couple of times in her presentation to blockchain technology, probably one of the safest concepts, I would say, in terms of traceability, just in that it locks down information. You cannot change records. Once they're inputted into the system, they're there to stay. They can't be lost. It's like an electronic storage database. But I think it's really good in terms of addressing issues like kind of adulteration of products or records even, and just how it works. You can see there's a lot of kind of barcode scanning and QR codes, and it's all very digitized and innovative. It is quite expensive, I believe, to set up. I'm not overly familiar with the costs, but I think for bigger organizations, this works really well because you can literally scan batches incoming and outgoing, and it all balances and matches up on the system. So I suppose there is advantages there for its use. Quick note on DNA traceback and biotags. This has become, bigger in Ireland, and I suppose we would be kind of known as a country, a farming country, so to speak, with you know, with animal welfare and everything like that. And DNA traceback, I suppose, on foot of the horsemeat scandal in 2013, DNA testing is big in Ireland. Even small businesses now would routinely test for 7 species as part of their kind of routine testing. And then biotags, I just have an example down the bottom there of a biotag which would go onto the live animal in the field and filter down, I suppose, through. So that's the kind of the traceability that follows the animal itself through the system. I'm going to finish up on a slide here, and I think everyone who's working kind of in official agencies will agree what we tolerate is what we worry most about. And I know it's true for myself. Even some nights you'd lie in bed and think, did we do enough? Did we do the right thing? You know, the best approach really is zero tolerance and being there to support the industry, to support the authorities, and it's about doing the right thing. So thank you for your time. That's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to